Hello, everybody. So thank you for joining us, and welcome to our first Blue Loop Innovation Session. We're very pleased to bring this to you in partnership with our friends at Christie. Before I get started, I just want to draw your attention to some features of the Crowdcast platform. You'll have seen the chat already, but you can see down at the bottom there's some polls. And also, if you want to ask a question, and we've put some questions in there from the registration forms, but you can just vote on the ones that you want. So just check if your question's already there, because we'll be looking at the most popular ones first. The session's being recorded, and you can access it afterwards on the same link. So please share it with anybody you think would be interested. We're going to talk about far-UVC today. It's groundbreaking technology that offers the potential for the first time to disinfect air and surfaces in indoor spaces where people are present. So it's huge implications for the visitor attractions industry, helping attractions reopen and also potentially stay open, which would be wonderful. I have with me today Brent Peckover from Christie and Martin Howe from Tech4 and Human 2.0. I'll just make this a little bigger so you can see. There we go. And Martin and Brent know far more about this subject than I do, so I'm going to hand over to Martin now. And Martin, can you tell us, please, what far-UVC light is?
Yes, thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Let's start with just the basics. As this simple diagram shows, ultraviolet light in band C, called UVC, isn't naturally found on Earth because it's blocked by the upper atmosphere. Therefore, humans haven't built up a natural barrier to it, and therefore, in sufficient doses, it can cause serious cellular damage. That's why there's a great deal of legislation around its use. However, we've known for over 100 years now that viruses don't have a natural protection against UVC either, and therefore UVC light is a very effective disinfectant. It kills viruses just by shining on them. The higher the intensity and the longer the duration, the more effective it is. UVC has already been in use for many years for disinfecting in a number of industries and applications, such as cleaning surgical operating theatres between uses and certain food production systems. Most critically, though, up till now, it has not been deployed where the UVC rays could irradiate shine on humans. The regulations strictly limit the amount of human exposure to UVC. This next slide goes into a bit more detail. So this is the light spectrum, both visible and non-visible light. And it's important to understand that UVC light covers a wide electromagnetic spectrum, much like visible light, where green, red, and blue are clearly very different and differentiated. So are frequencies of UVC. UVC in common use today is typically around 254 nanometers, simply because of the lamp technology that's been used. That wavelength is dangerous to humans because it can penetrate into the skin and into the eyes and cause damage. However, there's a kind of Goldilocks wavelength of ultraviolet light that's not too low to harm humans and not too high to be ineffective against viruses. That frequency is around about 222 nanometers. In fact, that's proving to be the perfect wavelength, even deadlier to viruses than 254 nanometers, and yet safer for humans than the longer wavelengths of ultraviolet UVC.
Thanks, Martin. So I like that. I like that description as a sort of Goldilocks wavelength. So I know that some people in the audience are already familiar with UVC light disinfection. So Brent, could you just go into a bit more depth about the key differences between UVC and far-UVC, please?
Sure, thanks, Rachel. So as Martin had said, germicidal light has been used for many decades for medical sterilization in operating rooms, sterilizing tools at your dentist, those types of things. Historically, we've used 254 nanometer light, and that's because we've used mercury lamps to generate the light in its very efficient generation of 254 nanometers. But the problem with 254 is that it penetrates the skin and the eyes, causing erythema and keratitis. 222 nanometer light, on the other hand, is much different. It inactivates viruses much the same way, but it doesn't penetrate the skin and the eyes the same way. 222 nanometer light tends to be absorbed by the dead skin layer, as well as the tear layer within your eye. So Colby University has done some testing. They have irradiated healthy human skin at up to 20 times the current limit, and they have found that there has been no long-term negative impacts to that skin. Columbia University has also done testing on mouse eyes. Surprisingly, people don't want to irradiate their eyes as part of a test, which I completely understand. And they have irradiated mouse eyes at 7 times the current limit. And you can see on the left here what happens when you irradiate a mouse eye with 150 millijoules of 254 nanometer light. You can see that clouding that's starting to appear. But that same amount of radiation with 222 nanometer light doesn't result in any clouding, and there's no indication of keratitis, so that's important. So, do we believe the limits can be raised? Well, we do believe that there is potential to raise the limits, but what we've found is that when you're generating 222 nanometer light, you also generate some trace wavelengths of longer wavelength, longer ultraviolet light. So Ushio, Care 222's manufacturer, which is the lamp that we use in our counteract device, they have developed a filter that they put in that attenuates longer UV wavelengths of greater than 230 nanometers. So you can see here the wavelengths that are normally generated with the 222 lamp, and then you can see the effect of the filter here, which largely removes them. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that not all 222 nanometer light is created equally. It's really important to get rid of these longer wavelengths that have an upsize impact on the effect of their use.
Okay, so we're talking about it being filtered into a very narrow range, aren't we? So I know many of us have seen, and some of us will have used other kinds of UVC technology, Brent. Can you take us through what the other kinds are and how do they compare with far-UVC?
Sure. So I would encourage people not to think of these as competing technologies. I'm going to choose one over the other. I would encourage people to think of how can I use these different tools in my environment to get the best possible result. So a couple of different examples we've often seen are UVC robots, which again are using 250 nanometer light. So the image on the left here, which is at one of the train stations, but I know it's also being used in Heathrow and those types of places where they have a robot that drives around at night when the place is unoccupied and shines UV light in an effort to reduce the amount of viral load in the space. Now, the challenge, of course, is that as soon as you have people walk into the space, they're bringing pathogens with them. So, it's great that you clean it every night, but, as soon as they walk back into the space, it's now being actively contaminated by the people in the space. And that's sort of where Care 222 is a little bit different, right? We can expose the space while there are people in it and continuously be inactivating viruses in the space, which is fantastic, right? Other types of technologies we see are in-air or in-duct systems, and these are great systems from the standpoint of not only do they inactivate air going through them, but they also can increase the efficiency of your HVAC system, specifically because they tend to kill off bacteria and other growth that tends to occur on cooling coils and those types of things, which means better heat transfer as well as better airflow across the cooling coils. So if you have an integrated air system in your facility, something like this is a possibility. And again, we're looking at complementary technologies, right? There's nothing that, well, this does a great job at inactivating air that goes through the ducts, viruses in the air that goes through the ducts. It doesn't do such a great job at inactivating anything that's in the surface because, of course, it's not exposed in the room. You also have to have an HVAC system in order for it to work. And the next important question is, how many times am I taking the air that's in the room and flowing it through that duct, right? You think about how much volume of air is in a room, and you're typically going to see, 2 or 3 air changes per hour. Another common technology that has been actually around since the 1930s and has been used in hospitals and homeless shelters and schools is upper room UV technology, where basically you take something that has a high ceiling and you shine UV across the top portion of the room at very high levels. Of course, you have to have the high ceiling because you don't want to expose the occupants below to it, but then you circulate the air, and as the air moves up into the upper portions of the room, it naturally gets inactivated. So this is especially efficient, and the other benefit is that you don't have to have a pre-existing HVAC system in order to drop it in. So,
thanks, Brent. So I think that's That's a really good introduction and explanation of what far-UVC is. So Martin, can you explain how you think this can play a key role in reopening attractions?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. As you know, we are quite good at looking into the future and seeing what technologies are coming down the road, and we've known about this coming for some time, and it's kind of coming at the right time and maybe just in time too. And we believe that this properly filtered far-UVC, in that I mean with this very narrow wavelength of around 220 nanometers and not much more, will be a critical tool in combating this coronavirus and the others that will probably come in the future. And it's the only method available today to continually combat coronaviruses on surfaces and the air directly around us while humans are present, unlike the others that Brent just explained. So, for example, now we're learning that aerosolized particles can linger in the air for hours. That's why recent recommendations around the world include significantly increasing the airflow of indoor spaces. However, that just isn't possible with many locations. So when integrated properly, these far-UVC fittings can be used to target those areas most at risk. For example, spaces where groups of people need to come together and will likely linger there for longer periods of time, not just passing through or waiting to pick up a coffee, for instance. So for attractions, these would include, say, theatres, pre-shows, boarding areas, event spaces, museum galleries, and even things like esports arenas. And within those locations, places such as eateries and toilets, but washrooms. And we also need to consider the other factor that there's a huge trust issue among the public now, which is inconsistent. Some people are more or less trusting than others. We all want to get back out and enjoy these spaces and to share these experiences again. And visitors are far more likely to book up and go somewhere that can clearly demonstrate that they are taking all possible measures to keep their visitors safe.
That's great. And Brent, I just noticed your daughter walking downstairs with a cup on her head as well.
The wonders of working at home. We're in isolation here in Ontario, so we're all working from home.
So it's entertaining for everyone. That's fine. So have you got anything to add about on the subject of reopening attractions and maybe around vaccines as well?
Yeah, I think vaccines are definitely going to play a role. It's important to build up that herd immunity, which is definitely going to help. But we're going to continue to see different strains show up. We're going to see future viruses. This isn't the first pandemic we've seen. I doubt it will be the last we've seen, right? So the great thing about UVC light is that it doesn't differentiate, right? It universally goes out and targets viruses and bacteria, irrespective of strain, origin, those types of things. So, there are definitely tools that we can make use of to make our lives better in the future, I think.
Yeah, sure. And I think this is a good point. We've to move on to more practical questions, because we've had quite a lot of practical questions come in. And one of them, which is obviously important to attraction designers, is that whether these devices emit visible light.
Sure. So they do emit a small amount of visible light. So if you were going to put it in, say, a very black room, then you would see it. But for the most part, if you're putting it in a lit room, you're not going to notice it unless you actually look at it. I do have a prototype device here. If you'd like to see it, would you like me to? Sure. Okay, I'm just going to draw the curtains to make the room a little darker, which will help accentuate the amount of light it produces.
Excellent. Okay, cool.
I don't know if my camera gain just automatically upped, but so here's the device. Okay. You basically have two parts to the device. You have the device itself, and then you have a housing that gets mounted. That we call this our receiver box. This gets mounted in the ceiling and is permanently affixed in the ceiling, but you can easily dismantle or remove the module itself, so that if there's a problem, you can just send us back the module, or if you need to replace lamps, you don't have to do it on a ladder. Except it's dark now, so I can't see the alignment jig. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to plug it in. So normally what would happen is you would install these in your ceiling and you'd run power directly to it. It wouldn't be a plug, but we do have a version of the receiver box that has a regular IEC adapter to it so that you can just, whether it's for a test jig or for something else that you're building, you can use a plug type structure to it. So what we have here, each of the eyes, you'll see it sort of looks like a face. This hole here and this hole here are sort of like a bowling ball, right? So this is how you grab onto the fixture itself, and it actually works exceedingly well. I have to say, when they first proposed it, I was a little skeptical, but it works really well. The eyes of the face are the Care 222 lamps. And then we have a motion sensor in the middle so that you can trigger your Care 222 lamps based on motion so that you can set it up and in your room and basically forget about it, right? You know, somebody walks into the room, it knows it needs to be on and it can turn on, right? But when somebody walks out or leaves, after a certain amount of time, you can have it turn off so that you're not unnecessarily burning your lamp hours. And then we have a reset button so that if you needed to do a factory reset, you could do that. And there are parameters around that to ensure that from a system perspective, we're trying to have some safety there so that people can't take control of the device. And this is something that's important to think about when you're looking at other vendors. You know, have they thought about the system implications of your device? Christie's a system company, so we very much look at these types of scenarios. So there is an application that exists on a tablet. It's just a regular Android tablet. I'm not going to bother walking you through the application, but as soon as I log in here, so I'll turn it on here, and that is now on. So you can see it's irradiating. Now this is a prototype. When I turn it off, our indicator lights aren't going to go off, but you will see the two lamps that are the Care 222 lamps, they will extinguish. So there is a minimum lamp on time of 15 seconds. So you just have to wait for the 15 seconds to go by, and we turn it off. So you can see that if you were to look directly at the unit, you would see that, oh, those lamps are on or off. But as far as the amount of visible light that's being contributed to the room, it's very small. All right.
That's great. Thank you, Brent, for doing that. It's really helpful to see the device actually switched on, I think. Another practical question we had, which I'm sure lots of people in the audience are wondering about, is how many devices you need in a room, or maybe that's more of a question around the sort of system design of it, especially in a theme park where you have more than one room and strange shaped attractions and things.
Sure. So first, let me give you a little bit of background as to things that we want to consider when we're developing these types of systems, right, or looking to apply these types of systems. So just like with any lighting fixture, right, the amount of coverage of the light is going to be dependent on ceiling height. If you move the unit up higher, it's going to end up covering more area, right? Our fixture, we can adjust the power to some extent, so we maintain the government guidelines that are restricting how much light we can put out for a particular area. So to some extent, height is irrelevant. We can throttle the power back and forth as we change the height. But height is important because it helps you understand the amount of spread that you're going to get, right? So if we look at the intensity of the light, okay, so you'll see there are waves now at the bottom of the image. Directly underneath the light, of course, you're going to have the most intensity. And when you move horizontally away from the center of the light, that intensity is going to fall off, right? So if we look at a single lamp and we were to put it in a graph, your highest peak power, which would be 100%, so to speak, or 1 in this particular case, would be directly underneath the lamp. And as you move left or right, you're going to get further and further away from being directly underneath the lamp, and the power is going to fall off over time. Right. So if we were to then look at a 3-lamp scenario where you have 3 of these fixtures placed in your ceiling, if you've spread them out, you could end up with points where you have a high amount of power directly below the unit, but importantly, you have a low amount of power in between the units. And if we're going to have uniform surface in activation, we want to try and minimize those troughs, right? So we have this peak to trough consideration that we want to think about. So what we can do is we can push those units closer together and overlap the output. And you'll see that as we overlap them, we start getting rid of those troughs, right? So in our system or in our calculators, we often look to say, okay, we're going to try and have a no more than a 30% variation peak to trough, so that we have a relatively uniform layer of inactivation across the space you're trying to inactivate. So we have two different types of mechanisms to determine the number of devices that you may need in a space. If you have a relatively straightforward space, let's say a rectangular room or a square that has a constant ceiling height throughout the space, we have an online calculator that you can go and you can use. It's at christidigital.com/UV-calculator, and you put in the size of your space, and it will suggest that, okay, you need this many fixtures. Keeping in mind that it doesn't know how you're using your space, so it's just assuming you want a blanket layer of protection across as much of your space as possible. Okay. If you have specific use cases or unique spaces, then we can look at a more advanced simulation where we can say, okay, you have, in this case, varying floor levels, or maybe it's not rectangular, or maybe you have a boardroom where you really care about the boardroom table in the middle and you're willing to sacrifice performance on the edges, in which case we may have a different fixture count, potentially lower, that would be more appropriate for your space. So between Christy and our partners, such as Human 2.0, we can definitely look at the custom applications or the uniqueness of your space and figure out what is the optimum number of fixtures for that area.
Yeah, and to add, I think, well, firstly, we've had our hands on a unit and got to use it and understand how to integrate it technically, and it really is a very simple piece of technology. Like a light fitting, the app is very easy to use and configurable. So that aspect of it is very straightforward. The part where I think most help and expertise will be required are in the critical decisions to make regarding the layering in of these devices alongside and on top of other COVID measures that are in place or planned. We've already mentioned that it's important to have this as an additional critical technology to provide layers of disinfection application in areas that all other technologies and techniques can't deliver, and that's why it's so important. So we can help determine where this technology will be the most effective, specifically which areas of the facility, and then review the number of units and precise placement for each unit to optimize the effectiveness and maximize the efficiency and, of course, the budget.
So this all looks really, really promising then, Martin. So is this the silver bullet? Is this what we've all been looking for?
No, there are no silver bullets. There's no single solution to the problem, as we've covered just earlier, and Brent identified some of the other technologies that are available. Vaccines are clearly critical, but they target specific strains which adapt and change, so that's a constant battle. We will still need, to a greater or lesser extent, to continue with a combination of measures like regular cleaning to address surface contamination, cleaning hands, face coverings, and already we're now seeing some countries mandating, as they're learning more, to use certified higher filtration masks than conventional face coverings. Social distancing is a valuable tool in this fight against the coronavirus. But that's far more problematic in confined spaces with normal air circulation and long dwell times. So this is a good candidate of where this technology can help most.
Thanks, Martin. That's really helpful and it's worth looking at the whole picture, isn't it? I think. So this is very new technology, and I think the regulations haven't really caught up with it. So, Brent, could you tell us about current regulations and what opportunities there are to update those for filtered far-UVC?
Sure. So most governments and organizations around the world have adopted the ACGIH threshold limit values. That's the American Conference of Governmental and Industrial Hygienists. They provide threshold limits values, which is the amount of energy an individual can be exposed to, or sorry, the guidelines around the amount of energy that an individual can be exposed to on an ongoing basis every day throughout the day. And while we would love to see a warp speed program or an emergency use designation to change those, unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. However, the existing legislation and the existing limits do allow us to leverage these devices in occupied spaces. We just have to manage how much energy they are outputting. So the current limit for 222 nanometer light is 22 millijoules per centimeter squared per 8-hour period. So if you were to look at bathing an individual continuously at the same level over that 8-hour period, that would equate to a 0.6 microwatt per centimeter squared exposure level throughout the day.
So what I think you're saying then is that we have to operate these devices based on guidelines that have been updated. So Brent, what needs to happen with regulations so that we can install them and then operate them at maximum effectiveness?
That's a great question. So as I alluded to earlier, there are various organizations that have looked at exposure and higher levels of exposure than the current guidelines. I think that it's important that we attenuate those longer wavelengths of UV light, that anything greater than 230. But people may be asking, well, if we can use them the way they are today, why do we need to raise the exposure limit, right? And I think that's a great question. And I think it goes back to what Martin mentioned earlier. The rate at which you inactivate viruses is dependent on the amount of the power that you're putting into them, or the power that you're exposing them to, as well as the amount of time that you're exposing them to that power. So for example, if you were to look at SARS-CoV-2 as an example, right? If you had a sample of SARS-CoV-2 and you were to expose it to, say, 3 millijoules per centimeter squared of, and I apologize for all the numbers, but I thought it would be worthwhile for people to hear some numbers, but 3 millijoules per centimeter squared of energy, you would achieve a 3 log or a 99.9% reduction in the you would inactivate 99.9%, which basically you don't really kill a virus because it's not really alive to start with, but you would make it so that it can no longer infect things and it can no longer replicate. So when we talk about inactivation, that's what we're talking about. We're inactivating its ability to clone itself or to replicate itself. So, if we were to use a filtered lamp and we were allowed to double the amount of power, then that would allow us to have the amount of time in order to achieve that same 99.9% reduction in the active virus count in the space. If we were to increase it to, say, 10 times, then we could do it in 1/10 of the time. So, this is definitely something that can make a difference in the amount of viral load in your space.
That's good. And Martin, you're working with Brunel University, I think, aren't you?
Yes. So part of the process we're working on together is to do more specific and targeted testing of this technology. So just last month, we delivered the unit to Brunel University in London. The initiative was led by a company called Space Republic to test COVID-secure technologies in their new tech-enabled work pods. These are kind of rent-by-the-hour workspaces that they're looking to deploy. And the whole initiative has been supported and part-funded by the UK government. The virologists at the university will, and actually are, I was talking to them earlier this week, spreading live COVID-19 virus on surfaces of these pods to verify how well far-UVC kills the virus and its DNA. We calculate how well and how effective it is. We have data on other coronaviruses, but this specific SARS-CoV-2 strain that we're suffering from now, we have it. That is the virus that's being tested. The university is interested for a number of reasons and has developed some highly sensitive ways to detect the virus, and this will help this testing, and we're expecting to see the results of this shortly, early next week, in fact, and they'll be published sometime later. And this is going to be one of the many ongoing programs to ensure that this technology is deployed safely. And of course, to Brent's point, optimally, we want to make it as effective as possible.
That's fantastic. So Brent, did I cut you off earlier? Did you have anything
No,
else to say?
no, you're fine.
Okay. That was okay, good. That's great. So then if we look towards the future then, Martin, maybe you could tell us what you see in the future and how we're going to future-proof our venues.
Yeah, well, those of you who know me, I keep saying we're living in the future, finally. And the future's now then. So we need to keep working on how best to deploy these new technologies as quickly as possible. They can make a huge difference now, this year, and on into the future. What's becoming clear over recent months is this virus isn't going to go away overnight. Vaccines should help dramatically with reducing the spread, but they won't eradicate it wholly. And attractions need to be able to deploy all the tools available and demonstrate to their visitors that they are taking all reasonable measures. Our role is to help design the most efficient and cost-effective placement of fittings within the prevailing regulations, which will adapt and to optimize these technologies as we go forward. Looking further into the future, I can foresee and imagine that far-UVC fittings will be mandated in public buildings, just like smoke detectors and sprinkler systems are. We're all learning all around the world that the massive human cost of this pandemic, and we're just coming to terms with the likely long-term financial cost. I don't think we can simply afford to make this mistake again, to be as unprepared as we were for this global catastrophe.
And Brent, do you have anything to add on that? What do you think about having these devices in buildings as building regulations?
Yeah, I definitely think that we will see building codes change. They will be revised to include pathogen reduction systems. I know that ASHRAE has, which is the group that focuses on heating and air conditioning. They have looked at various studies. I know when they were looking at upper room UV systems, and they found that while the cost of the system may be high initially, there is actually beneficial savings in reduced healthcare costs. And while those seem to be relatively small, they pay for the system many times over. And that doesn't even account for the potential reduction in spread should there be a future pandemic, right? That would not have been factored into those calculations. So
that's great.
Yeah, so I think these types of things will pay for themselves many times over.
Thanks, both of you. I think you covered that really well in just over 30 minutes. So as a next step, what should people do who want to learn more, who are interested in the technology for their venue? Martin, if you could do that one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is new for everybody. And so first to mention, hot off the press, together with Christy, we've just launched our Counteract pilot program. This offers comprehensive technical support, marketing support, and preferential pricing to what will be a select group of venues that we envisage will become industry beacons, reference sites, case studies, demonstrating the best use of this technology, how best to implement this technology and measure its effectiveness and measure visitor reaction alongside other COVID secure measures. So certainly if you're interested, just go to our website, which is listed, but it's www.human2.0.com and fill in a few details to apply there. And alongside that, our contact page on our website, we can send you get in contact there, and we'll send you a simple questionnaire that allows us to do a preliminary assessment of your needs and of course answer any specific questions to start you on this kind of journey of discovery of how this technology alongside others used in attractions can help us open better and safer.
Great, thank you. And Brent, have you got anything to add on that?
Sure. We have lots of great information available at christydigital.com/UV, which is always available. And you can also click, I think that's a little green button down at the bottom that says find out more, that you can also use to jump directly to that as well. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move on to the questions now. So we've got quite a lot of questions here. We've got 20 questions and quite a lot of voting. So that's great. Thank you, everybody. So the first one is, when will it be approved and available for use?
That's a great question. So we're currently going through CE and UL approvals. You'll notice that if you look at other other 222 nanometer devices, none of them are certified. We have not been able to find a single one that has a industry standard certification, which is a little concerning. But yes, we're going through CE and UL because we are, of course, a very conservative company. Want to make sure everybody's protected and that we dot all the boxes. So that is expected to be complete by early April, and the devices will be in production by late May.
Great, thanks for that. Next one, what are the near-term future applications of far-UVC light for disinfection and attractions? Do you get the near-term future applications?
Gosh, well, we covered, I think, some of those off, haven't we, in attractions, and I think it'll be the ones where it has the most effective incremental effect alongside other uses. I was asked just the other day whether they could be implemented in outdoor spaces. The answer is yes, but is that really the best use of budget, time, resources? So it really is on a case-by-case basis, I think, and that's why we, Christine, I'm sure others will be tooling up to make sure that we carefully understand your operation, your venue, your facility to design in the most effective deployment of this technology.
I think I'd seen in the chat as well, I think people are asking about restaurants, bars, concert halls, and also water parks, and I know we've got somebody from a spa as well here.
Yes, and yes. I've got a personal view about restaurants, which is potentially they are risky spaces because people dwell there for long periods of time and they can't utilize one of the important technologies to help spread the virus, which is a face mask. So that is an area that I think is a strong contender. We need to carefully consider all of the implications of that. But yeah, I think restaurants could be a very strong contender because there's a few other ways to deal with that. Water parks are interesting because some of the chemicals in the system, in the water treatment systems, can actually help too, right? So is this technology helpful? Probably yes. But again, we need to think about where in those spaces. Changing rooms could be a good example. And that has to tie in also with the level of dose we can apply and how that will change over time as the regulations catch up with the technology that's available.
Great, thanks for that. The next one, so we have, how easy is it to install the equipment? So I think we saw that from Brent, it looked pretty easy.
Yeah, it's basically a commercial lighting fixture. It's on par with a commercial lighting fixture. So you're going to cut a hole in your ceiling. Typically, you want to flush mount it in your ceiling. You're going to run power to it. Of course, you'll have a certified electrician to do that and wire it up. And then really, you just insert the device into the housing. And there's an app that you can use to set up the device. But once it's set up, the idea is that you can forget about it until you need to do the lamp change. And the system tracks the number of hours and notifies you when you need to do some maintenance activity on it.
And just like a light fitting, there may be areas where you want to suspend the fittings lower to get the appropriate and correct coverage. So you might actually hang them from pendants. But yeah, practically speaking, it's very straightforward, and it can be regarded as a regular light fitting.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, how does it affect paint and fabric?
That's a great question. So we're talking about risk group 0 levels initially. So we do have some testing set up so that if you have some samples you would like to send to us, we can irradiate them and we can send them back to you so that you can see the result. The testing that we've done thus far is that if you were to irradiate some of these materials for the equivalent of risk group 0 for, say, 5 years, you will see some degradation over time. You just looking at the sample, if you take a white, for example, it will yellow over time, but the amount of yellowing will not be perceivable. So if you were to just look at the sample on its own, you would not look at it and say, "Ooh, that turned yellow." But if you were to take the original paint chip or the original sample and put it beside it, so you had two samples, so to speak, you would say, oh, that is a little yellower, but it's not something that would be objectionable in our experience. Of course, if you're talking about artifacts, museums, artwork, those types of things, we of course recommend that you don't expose those very unique pieces that are not reproducible to UV light, because we have no idea how they will react, and we would hate for some of these artifacts to be lost. So.
And that's common in museums anyway. Certain pieces need to have the lighting treatment in those spaces, take that into account. And again, in the context of that, these can be thought about just as a regular light fit in terms of understanding its characteristics and the characteristics of what it's illuminating. But the Brunel test in particular, one of the measurements is to understand how that impacts any fabrics there. It's a very small pod and it's a very high dosage, so we can have a very accelerated test, so we'll get a lot of good data out of that.
Great, thanks for that. Next one, what's the cost?
Well, you have to always look at it from a system perspective, right? So, I think it's very difficult to say, how much is it going to cost without understanding how many fixtures you're going to need and what other types of tools are you going to put in place. So what's your overall strategy? So we can definitely help you determine the number of fixtures you're going to need, and then whether you're a integrator or an end user, we can definitely work with you to get you some costs based on the unique aspect of your particular solution. So reach out to myself or Martin or your integrating partner if you have one, and we will absolutely work with them to get you a cost.
Great, thank you. What's the length of time needed for effectiveness before the next visitor enters?
So that's a great question. When I hear that question, and I do hear that question from time to time, I'm concerned that people are thinking in the wrong mode of use, right? If you're looking for something where you're going to use it in between visitors, again, this is probably not the right technology for you. What you're looking for probably is a risk group 3 level, where you're going to bake your room with a very high dose of probably germicidal 254 light, because it's more cost efficient, but nobody can be there, and it will only be clean when people come into the space, right? If you have somebody who's bringing pathogens in, and that's typically how it works, right? Immediately that space will no longer be clean. 222 nanometer light, on the other hand, is something that can be used on an ongoing basis. So it's not about how quickly can we clean the space, it's about the space is always receiving light that is inactivating pathogens in the space. So,
okay.
Yeah, think about it is you've always got a cleaning crew always cleaning the space all the time, and imagine the cost of that.
Great, thank you. This one I think is for me. So is this being recorded? Yes, it is being recorded, and it will come up. It takes about half an hour to process, and it will be available on this link with all the chat and the Q&A as well. So please come back here and share it with anybody you think would be interested. Thank you. Okay, next one. Apart from the time to implement it, is this technology energy efficient?
So that is also a question we get fairly commonly, and I struggle to answer it from the standpoint of there is no competitive benchmark for what we would consider energy efficient when irradiating occupied spaces, right? Because there's nothing else to compare it to. At the moment, the only source of 222 nanometer filtered 222 nanometer light is the Ushio Care 222 lamp. So I would say we are the most energy efficient in this market, but that's only because we have nothing else to compare to. So
okay. Okay. So Lloyd says, I've been told that 254 nanometer is much more effective. Comments?
Our testing has shown, or not our testing, but the studies that I've read and the information I've been given shows that there isn't a lot of difference. Some viruses, 254 works a little bit better. Other pathogens and viruses and bacteria, 222 works a little bit better. So, it's not that 254 provides many orders of magnitude more efficiency. They're very similar, with the exception of something like spores or something where you have a hardened pathogen that is resistant to both of them. So yeah. I actually might have a backup slide for that. So if you just give me a minute, I might be able to show you some numbers that we have.
And there is, it can get quite specific. And one of the tests that Brunel University are doing is to help answer that question. They are using this device to irradiate this virus. So they will have precise data and compare that to other technologies on exactly the same SARS-CoV-2 samples.
I think that maybe goes down to the next question as well, which is where can we find the published results? Is that kind of
for that particular test? I was there a few weeks back talking to them about it. So when do we get the results? It takes a while. We will have them early, very early probably. But in terms of publishing results, there's a whole process, as you know, of scientists like to do, and rightly so, process for publicizing peer-reviewed results. So it will take some time. But importantly, we will have that data and understand that data to apply that data to our calculations of how best to use it in these spaces. But as soon as possible is actually the totally right answer. I just can't give you a date on that right now.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I think we've got Brent, you've got a picture for us.
Yeah, so this is just some comparisons between how much energy is required to achieve a 3 log reduction when you're using 222 nanometer light versus 254 nanometer light. And while in some cases you'll see 222 is higher, in other cases you'll see 254 is higher, but they're for the most part on the same order of magnitude. So it's not, so while yes, as you get away from those optimum curves, it drops down. Surprisingly, it does come back up for 222. So this is why we talk about it, as Martin said, the Goldilocks wavelength. So
that's great. Thank you. Thanks for fishing that out, Brent.
No.
The next one is, how cost effective is it in comparison to the amount of chemicals that we are using?
So that is an interesting question. And I think the challenge is that you have to really compare apples and oranges, right? So if you're just talking about the chemicals themselves, well, if I put a bucket of chemicals in the room, they're not going to clean the room either. I have the labor in order to use those chemicals. And most of the time, I'm not, as Martin said, actively walking around and cleaning the room while the people are in the room, right? So it's not really an apples to apples comparison to say, hey, how much is it if I just keep using chemicals versus using something which is going to inactivate viruses that are in the air and on surfaces, in occupied spaces. They're somewhat different. So I would argue you can't really compare them. So.
And that is part of the rationales. One of the rationales for launching this pilot program is to find customers, venues that want to work in this team to understand all these metrics and measure, use data, measure as much as possible, both real data and also visitor views and opinions on whether venues that apply as many systematic solutions as possible are more trustworthy than those that don't. So it's things that we're yet to learn. This is so new.
Great, thank you. We've got a question now from Fabrice. Is there any medical certification proving that this device is effective against COVID-19?
So Columbia, I think it was Columbia University, has done testing with COVID-19 and has demonstrated that the device does inactivate COVID-19. So, yes.
So, yes.
Not a medical certification, but it is independent university testing because, of course, COVID-19 is a class 3 pathogen, so it can only be handled in a class 3 biosafety lab, right? Which is typically a university. So it has to be, testing has to be done using a class 3 biosafety lab. But yes, testing has been done, and it does inactivate COVID-19, or SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, to be more specific.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got one from Kate. Do you have any case study data that could help people make ROI decisions, like reduce sick days after installation or similar metrics?
So, as I say, the device will be available in May, late May. So we don't have any data specifically associated with this device, but there is data that is available just in general about return on investment and the value of pathogen inactivation systems in spaces. So, and as I say, I found that information through ASHRAE. So ASHRAE actually calls out some of that information in their guidelines.
Okay, great. We've got another question from Kate here. What's the recommended maximum mounting height and spacing for fixture?
So spacing for fixture is going to depend on your ceiling height. We can absolutely work with you to figure out the optimum spacing based on the particular needs of your space. The two unit version will provide risk group 0 level power up to approximately 28 feet. Beyond 28 feet, if we were to, in order to achieve risk group 0 level, we would have to start overlapping devices. So possible, but that would be
maybe dependent on if the
or we pendant it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, we've got one here from Pierre. So what is the dose applied by the unit in, is that megajoules per centimeter squared? That's very specific.
That's very specific. I think it would be better to understand what the use case is. So if you want to reach out to us afterwards, we'd be happy to work through that with you. The risk group 0 level, as I say, is 0.76 microwatts per centimeter squared, right? So that would be what we would be limited to. So, irrespective of what the device can put out, that's how much it would have to be throttled back to.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, one from Jan then. Any research results inside enclosed spaces with guests inside, depending on the number of guests? Is that?
I guess the question would be, what type of results would we be looking for, right? We are not able to capture and grow COVID samples if that's the area of interest, and that's commonly the area of interest, without working with a BioLab 3, as I'd mentioned, and to date, we haven't had the opportunity to do that. So any of the biolabs that we've reached out to have all been completely swamped, as you can imagine, with just public health requests associated with meeting COVID testing and things like that. So
maybe to add, I can't share this data publicly yet, but some of the work that Brunel University are doing is to find quite innovative ways of evaluating this data and doing these tests. So this is a journey. This is day one of a long journey, and we're going to get smarter, get more data, adapt the regulations, and like I say, as I hope, these devices will be like fire sensors and sprinkler systems. They'll be around us, because we all know the answers to many questions that we can't know today because we've just started.
Okay, thanks for that. I think maybe we've covered this one. Is there a minimum size space for this unit? From Dave, this is.
There is no minimum size space. You'll just end up illuminating your walls if you use it in a telephone booth.
Okay, and then from Peter, how long is the filter guaranteed to work safely, not emitting the light dangerous wavelengths?
So the lamps themselves have a 3,000 hour life, and the filter is guaranteed to work for the 3,000 hours.
Okay, great. Okay, is the company making these a publicly traded company?
Yes.
Does it want to buy shares?
Ushio is a publicly traded company, and they actually received an award of one of the top 40 companies likely to change the world as a result of this technology.
Yeah.
So,
Right. Okay. So, thanks, Cliff, for that one. Does this lamp produce ozone? Usually, it does.
so there is going to be some ozone production, but it's going to be very, very small. I don't have test results. I know that there has been some other testing that's been done, and the threshold is so small that it wasn't detectable, I'm told, but I don't have direct access to that data. So I would expect there is some level of ozone produced, but it should be within current guidelines, and it will have to be within current guidelines in order to be operated in any space. So
it's a good question, actually. We've got another unit here. I won't say what it is. It's a different kind of approach. It's a shielded ultraviolet 254 nanometer device, and we've used it for ourselves as well as in applications, and that definitely does produce a lot of ozone. I think it's quite objectionable, so yeah, it's a good question. It's valid, and definitely the levels that Brent is referring to is negligible. That's the important point.
Great, thanks for that. We've just got two more. Kelly says, do you think these could work in places like theme parks and rides? So I think we definitely do, don't we?
Yeah, we definitely do.
Yeah, that's great. And last one, we have from Dan. Could I use far-UVC light today while maintaining the 23, is it millijoules or megajoules? Megajoules must be per centimetre squared. Is this legal in the Netherlands?
So I can't speak specifically for the Netherlands, but I'd be happy to look it up for you. 22 millijoules, not megajoules. Megajoules would be a reactor type of thing, but millijoules, which is 1/1000th of a joule, right, is the daily exposure limit recommended, or the guideline from the ACGIH. So yeah, for a risk group 0, it's no more than 22 millijoules per centimeter squared. So of course that's for every little tiny centimeter, right, of exposure in the area. So.
Okay, that's great. We made it through all the questions. Thank you very much for that, for Brent and Martin. That's been really, really useful. So yeah, thanks to Christy for partnering with us on this session, and thanks to everybody who's joined it. I hope you found it really useful. Brent and Martin were very knowledgeable, much more knowledgeable than I am, obviously. And if you want to contact them afterwards, you'll see on the slide, which I'm just going to make big here, is the contact details. There we go. And they'll be able to answer more questions if you have them. If you'd like to know more about creating a blue loop innovation session, then contact me. And this session is going to be recorded, and it processes automatically, so it'll be back on here probably in about half an hour, maybe, I think. And then you'll be able to see all the questions, and you'll be able to see the chat, and you can share it with anybody you think would find it useful. So thanks to Christy. Final thanks to Brent and Martin, and for everyone for coming, and hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Rachel. Pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure. It's been fun. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.